Picture him for a second. The little man with one hand tucked into his coat, the big hat, the sour temper, barely tall enough to see over his own generals. Almost none of that is real. The hand in the coat was just how gentlemen posed for portraits back then. The bad temper is a caricature. And the height, the thing everyone knows, that he was tiny, is the most famous mistake of all. When they measured his body, they wrote down 5 feet 2. But they measured him in French inches, and a French inch was longer than an English one. Do the conversion and he lands near 5'6", average for his time, maybe a touch above. The short emperor was a cartoon, drawn by the people who wanted him to look ridiculous, and it worked so well it has outlived him by 200 years. So if the picture in your head is wrong, what was the man actually like? And what did he leave behind that had nothing to do with the battlefield? Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born on Corsica in August 1769 in a town called Ajaccio. The timing matters. France had taken control of the island only the year before, buying out Genoa's old claim and then crushing the local independence fighters in the hills. So he arrived as a French subject by about 12 months. Any earlier, and the most French ruler in history would have been born a foreigner. His family were minor nobility, more proud than rich, and the name on his birth record wasn't French at all. It was Italian, with an extra U tucked in after the B. Bonaparte. He would quietly drop that U later, once it suited him to be French. His mother, Letizia, was tough, practical, and frightening when she needed to be, and she ran a crowded house on not much money. There were 8 surviving children, and he was the second. From the start, he was caught between 2 countries and fully at home in neither. That feeling of being the outsider who has to prove he deserves a seat at the table never really left him. At 9 years old, he was shipped to the mainland, to a military school at Brienne packed with the sons of French aristocrats. It went badly at first. He spoke French with a thick Corsican accent. He had no money to keep up with the other boys, and they let him know it. They mocked the accent, mocked the island, mocked the idea that this scholarship kid was really a noble. So he did what a certain kind of lonely, furious child does. He got good at something they couldn't touch. For him, that was mathematics, the cool, exact logic of numbers and angles. It pushed him toward the artillery, the most technical branch of the army, the one that ran on geometry and calculation instead of bloodline. At 16, he was a commissioned officer. He was low in rank, poor, provincial, and easy to overlook. What nobody at Brienne understood was that the boy they had laughed at had been quietly measuring the distance between where he stood and the very top. And he meant to cover every inch of it. Then the world he had trained for blew apart. In 1789, the French Revolution tore down the monarchy, and within a few years the king was dead and the country was at war with half of Europe. For an ambitious young officer with no family connections, the chaos was the best thing that could have happened. Rank suddenly went to whoever could actually win. In 1793, the port city of Toulon rose against the revolutionary government and opened its harbour to the British fleet. The artillery commander there was wounded, and a captain of 24 talked his way into the job. He saw at once what the older generals had missed, that if he seized one hill and its guns, he could force the British ships to leave. He was right. The port fell, and he came out of it a brigadier general. 2 years later, when a royalist mob marched on the government in Paris, they handed him the defense of the city. He met the crowd with cannon fire in the streets and scattered it in minutes. The men in power had found someone useful. They would soon find him very hard to control. His reward was command of France's army in Italy, on paper the least impressive army France had. It was underfed, unpaid, and dressed in rags. What happened next is where the legend really starts. In a little over a year, he marched that ragged army through a string of victories that stunned Europe, beating bigger and better supplied forces again and again on speed and nerve alone. He moved faster than anyone thought an army could move, appeared where he wasn't expected, and struck before his enemies were ready. His soldiers, who had been starving, began to worship him. It was here they gave him the nickname that history would later twist. They called him the Little Corporal, and it had nothing to do with his height. It was affection, from men watching a general who took the same risks they did. And Bonaparte, who understood something about fame that most soldiers never grasp, made sure the newspapers back in Paris printed every word of it. Just before the campaign, he had married a widow named Josephine, older than him, elegant, and already famous in Paris society. He was building an image now, as carefully as he built a battle plan. His next move was stranger, and it nearly ended him. In 1798, he sailed for Egypt, the idea being to threaten Britain's trade routes to India and to plant French power in the east. He brought scholars, scientists, and artists along with the soldiers, and one of them turned up a slab of carved stone near a town called Rosetta. That block, the Rosetta Stone, would eventually let scholars crack the code of Egyptian hieroglyphs for the very first time. But the campaign itself was a disaster in the making. The British Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in a bay and destroyed almost all of it in a single night, sinking or capturing 11 of 13 warships. In one stroke, the army that had sailed to Egypt was stranded there, cut off from home with no way back. A lesser man's career ends on that beach. Instead, he read the latest news from France, saw a government that was weak and widely hated, quietly left his stranded army to its fate, slipped past the British ships in the dark, and sailed home to make himself the answer to the chaos. Back in Paris in 1799, he joined a plot to overthrow the government, and when the plotting broke down into shoving in a hall full of frightened politicians, it was the soldier who came out on top. He made himself first consul, which was a polite phrase for the man in charge. Then he got to work, and this is the part the cartoons leave out. He was a genuinely brilliant administrator. He overhauled France's taxes, its banks, its schools, and above all, its laws. The old country had run on a tangle of local rules that changed from town to town. He swept them away and replaced them with a single clear code, the same for everyone, equal before the law, careers thrown open to talent instead of birth. That last idea was personal. He was the outsider who had clawed his way up, and now he wrote the rules so the next outsider could climb the same way. In 1804, he took the final step and crowned himself emperor, in a ceremony at Notre-Dame with the Pope himself standing right there. The story goes that he lifted the crown and set it on his own head, so that no one, not even the church, could ever say they had handed him his power. For a few years he was close to unstoppable. In 1805, near a village called Austerlitz, he faced the combined armies of Russia and Austria, two emperors in the field against him at once. He baited them into attacking what looked like a weak point in his line, then split their army in half. It is still taught in military academies as close to a perfect battle. By his mid-30s, he ruled or controlled most of continental Europe, setting his brothers and friends on thrones like pieces on a board. A couple of years earlier, he had also made one deal that reshaped a different continent entirely. Short of money, and having just lost a brutal war against the slave revolt in the Caribbean, he sold France's enormous Louisiana territory to the young United States for a bargain price. With the stroke of a pen, America doubled in size. He was, by any measure you like, at the summit. And this is the moment worth marking, because almost everything after it runs downhill. The trouble with a man who wins everything is that he never learns the one lesson that actually matters, which is when to stop. The unraveling started in Spain. To strangle Britain by cutting off its trade, Bonaparte had ordered all of Europe to stop dealing with it, and to enforce that he needed to control every coastline, Spain and Portugal included. So in 1808, he forced his own brother onto the Spanish throne. The Spanish people flatly refused to accept it. What followed wasn't a war between armies he could win in an afternoon. It was a grinding insurgency, ambushes and knives in the dark, a whole country that would not be occupied. He poured in hundreds of thousands of troops, and they bled away in the hills, year after year. He had a name for it himself. He called it his Spanish ulcer, the wound that would not close. It was the first clear sign that his great gift, winning fast and decisive battles, was almost useless against an enemy that simply refused to line up and be beaten. He should have read the warning. Instead, he turned and looked east, toward the one country large enough to swallow his entire army whole. In the summer of 1812, he gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen, and marched it into Russia. Something over 400,000 men crossed the border in the first wave, part of a force of more than 600,000 pulled from every corner of his empire. His plan was the one that had always worked. Find the enemy army, smash it in one enormous battle, and dictate the peace. But the Russians wouldn't play. They retreated, and as they went they burned their own crops and their own villages, everything a hungry army might use. He kept advancing, deeper and deeper, chasing a battle that kept backing away. In September the armies finally collided at Borodino, and it was a slaughter, tens of thousands dead in a single day with no clear winner. He pushed on and took Moscow, certain the Russians would now surrender. Instead, the city burned around him, and still no one came to talk. He had reached the enemy's capital, and won nothing at all. Then the winter came. The retreat out of Russia is one of the great catastrophes in the whole history of war. Starving, frozen, picked apart by Cossacks on the flanks, the army that had marched in hundreds of thousands strong staggered back out a broken remnant. A famous chart of the campaign draws the column of men as a thick band that thins to a thread, from over 400,000 down to a final few thousand still in formation. He had destroyed his own army without losing one single decisive battle. After Russia, his enemies smelled blood. The countries he had beaten and bullied for years all came at him together. In 1813, at Leipzig, more than 500,000 men fought the largest battle anyone would see before the 20th century, and he lost it. His empire folded inward. In 1814, the Allies took Paris, forced him off the throne, and packed him off to Elba, a tiny island off the Italian coast, where they let him keep the empty title of emperor and rule a speck of land. That should have been the end. It wasn't. Less than a year later, he slipped off the island with about 1,000 men and landed in the south of France. The king sent soldiers to arrest him. Rather than fight them, he walked out in front of their guns, threw open his coat and told them that if any man there wanted to shoot his emperor, here he was. They changed sides on the spot. He marched to Paris, gathering an army as he went, and took his throne back without firing a shot. It lasted 100 days. On the 18th of June, 1815, near a Belgian village called Waterloo, his luck finally ran out. The rain had turned the field to mud. A Prussian army arrived just in time to save the crumbling British line, and by nightfall the man who had terrified Europe for 20 years had lost everything for good. This time they made absolutely sure. They shipped him to Saint Helena, a scrap of volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest coast. There was no slipping away from there. He spent his last years in a damp house, dictating his memoirs, refighting old battles on paper, and slowly getting sick. On the 5th of May, 1821, he died, at 51. And even his death refused to be simple. The autopsy pointed to stomach cancer, a large, ulcerated growth that had most likely bled out. But decades later, tests on strands of his hair turned up arsenic, and a theory took hold that he had been slowly poisoned, murdered in exile by someone close to him. For years, this was a real scientific argument, not a crank one. Then better analysis showed the arsenic ran through his hair from every stage of his life, and turned up in his family's hair too. The ordinary background poison of a century that laced it into wallpaper and medicine. In 2021, a team of pathologists went back over the original evidence and came down firmly on one side. He died of the cancer. The most feared man in Europe was killed by his own stomach, alone on a rock, watched over by the enemies who could never quite believe he would stay put. Here is the part that gets forgotten. Strip away the battles, the empire, the map of Europe he redrew and then lost, and something is still standing. The set of laws he wrote as first consul, the code that made everyone equal in the eyes of the state and threw careers open to talent, outlasted every throne he ever built. It became the model for legal systems across Europe and Latin America, and in its updated form it is still the backbone of French law today. He was no simple hero. That same code stripped away rights that women had won in the revolution, handing husbands authority over their wives, and his wars killed somewhere between 3 and 7 million people, a number that stays vague because the record-keeping could never keep pace with the dying. But the man himself understood exactly where his real monument stood. Near the end, in exile, he is supposed to have said that his true glory was never the 40 battles he won, because a single defeat like Waterloo could wipe all of those away. What would last forever, he said, was his civil code. He was right. 19 years after he died on that island, France brought his body home and laid it in the heart of Paris, under a great golden dome, as if to admit that whatever he had been, they could never quite let him go. So the little man with his hand in his coat was never really little, and the temper and the funny hat are the least interesting things about him. The real one was a poor outsider from an island that had only just become French, mocked for his accent, who decided to outwork and outthink every person who had ever laughed at him. He reorganized the continent, wrote laws that still govern millions of people, and then threw the whole thing away because he could never find the edge of his own ambition. The cartoon his enemies drew is the version most people still carry around. But the man underneath it changed the world far more with the Book of Civil Law than with any of the battles we actually remember him for. That is the strange trick in how we remember the powerful. We keep the costume and forget the substance. So here is a question worth sitting with. If you had to be remembered for one thing, the loud victories or the quiet rules that outlast you, which would you pick? Tell me in the comments. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, you already know what to do.